You'll never succeed. What's that? It's a curse. And again, I've dealt with people who've had to be delivered from a curse pronounced by a teacher. There's many different... Another person who can do it is a pastor, because a pastor has spiritual authority over his congregation. Suppose a pastor has a clash with a member of his congregation. That person leaves, maybe in a bad spirit. The pastor says, wherever you go, you'll never succeed. Till you put things right with this church, you'll never get on anywhere. Do you think pastors ever talk like that? Believe me, they do. You know what that is? It's a curse. Religious groups are terrible about that. If you break away from some groups, they will automatically put a curse upon you. And believe me, that's not something that is of no consequence. It's real. We've got to go on. The next category is a very common one, self-imposed curses. Curses that people pronounce on themselves. We'll go back to the story of Isaac and Rebekah. You remember that Rebekah had persuaded Jacob to steal the blessing, or to get the blessing. I wouldn't say exactly steal it, but cheat his way into the blessing. Now, Jacob was smart, and he said in Genesis 27:12, perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to him to be a deceiver, and I shall bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. And his mother said to him, on me be thy curse, my son. It'll come on me, not on you. She pronounced a curse on herself. Later on in the chapter, she said to her husband, Isaac, she complained about the wives that Esau had married, who were the daughters of Heth, and she didn't approve of them. Actually, they have a saying amongst the Jewish people, I don't know whether you've ever heard it, about a Yiddish mama, a Jewish mother, who basically seeks to determine the whole course of her family, her children, everything. There's a story about one that was in a theater, and she said, is there a doctor in the house? And this man stood up and she said, boy, do I have a daughter for you. If you've never met the type, but they're not only found amongst Jewish people, they're found amongst all races. The mother who runs everybody, plans everybody's life, determines whom everybody should marry. Well, Rebekah really wasn't getting things the way she wanted them, and she said this to Isaac in verse 46, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, like these who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life do to me? You see, she pronounced a double curse on herself. She said, I'm weary of my life. What's the good of living? I might as well die. And I cannot tell you how many people we've dealt with who've pronounced a curse on themselves by saying, I wish I were dead. What's the good of living? I'm not going to make it. You don't have to say that very often. It's like an invitation to the spirit of death. And you don't have to give many invitations. He'll come in. We've seen scores of people delivered from the spirit of death. In one meeting in Northern Ireland in November last year, I prayed collectively for the people that needed deliverance from the spirit of death in an audience of about 2,000 people, and about 50 people received simultaneous deliverance, and most of them were young people. How does it come in? This attitude of hopelessness. No good living. What's got life got to offer to me? I might as well be dead. Brothers and sisters, it's a terribly dangerous thing to say. You're really pronouncing a curse on yourself. And you know how busy the devil is to trick you into saying that? You sometimes say it for very inadequate reasons, in a fit of pique or discouragement, but you're settling your own destiny. One other tragic example from the New Testament, familiar I'm sure to most of us, Matthew 27. Matthew 27, verses 24 and 25. The scene of the trial of Jesus by Pontius Pilate. Verse 24, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. What's that? It's a self-imposed curse. And you really cannot understand the history of the Jewish people over the last 19 centuries until you see that one major factor in it is a self-imposed curse that goes on from generation to generation to generation. His blood be upon us and our children, where the word children in that context means our succeeding generation. It's tragic. Terrible. The next source of curses is men representing Satan, witch doctors. Now, don't laugh at me, but I think I know what it is in Maori. Tohonga, is that right? Yeah, well, it's every language has that word, believe me. And they are experts at cursing. That's their profession. And they're very skillful. They know how to do it. In East Africa, when I was principal of a college for training African teachers, one of my students from a certain remote mountain area told me this story. He said in his village, 2 families quarreled. And one family went to the witch doctor, paid him a kid, a goat, and said, put a hex on the other family. And the witch doctor said, all right. At midnight on a certain night, a jackal will cry in the village, and the son of that family will die. And at midnight on that night, a jackal cried, and the son died. If he didn't die of anything else, he died of sheer fright. You understand? Ruth and I were in Zambia last year, and one of the ministries that we have is praying for barren women who can't have children. And so out of this large crowd of about 7,000 people, we called for women in that condition. About 400 women came forward for prayer. And before we prayed for them, we asked the interpreter to ask them how many of them had been to a witch doctor to get a potion to enable them to have children. And there were only 2 that didn't raise their hands out of 400. See, if you know parts of Africa, they are totally dominated by witch doctors. Everything in their lives is controlled by the unseen spiritual power of witch doctors. When we came with this message there about the release from the curse, it was one of the most dramatic changes I've ever seen in people. After they had listened to my teaching and said the prayer after me, those people were visibly transformed. Up to that time, you hardly saw them smile. From then on, they were some of the happiest people I've ever seen. The change was like from night to day. And one well-dressed man, obviously a well-to-do man, when I walked down from the platform, he came up and rubbed himself in the dust, which is their way of expressing appreciation and honor. And he said through the interpreter, I've been a wretched man all my life. I've been in continual pain for years. He said, now I'm free, I have no more pain, and I'm happy. And his face was radiant. And the only thing that had happened was we'd released him from the curse. See, we've become so civilized in some places that we've lost touch with some things that are very real. But they're still real even if we don't believe in them. You can say you don't believe in viruses, but if you get one, you'll get sick. The example, we don't need to go into detail, in the Bible is Balaam, the witch doctor. The king of Moab knew he couldn't defeat Israel in war, so he hired Balaam and said, come and pronounce a curse on them. Because I know the one you is cursed and the one you bless is blessed. That's typical. Most African tribes, before they go into battle, they'll get the witch doctor to put a curse on their enemies. Then they believe they'll be able to defeat them. And that does perhaps not so far away as Africa. All right, 2 more, and we are coming near the end of this part. Another source of similar problems is what I call soulish prayers or utterances. And I'd just like to turn very quickly to James chapter 3. I am trying to make this brief, but I want to make it complete, because some of you may not have another opportunity. James chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. James is talking about two kinds of wisdom, and he talks about one that's not God's wisdom. And he says it has three characteristics. It's earthly. Then he says in Greek it's soulish. It's the expression of the soul, not of the spirit. And when it's that, the next thing it is demonic. And I'll tell you that there are some people who pray for you that you'd be better off without their prayers. That sounds shocking. But you see, some people, if you're a preacher, for instance, they've got their own ideas of what your ministry should be and where you should go, and they'll try to pray you there. And it may not be at all the will of God. But you have this pressure against you every time you try to do certain things, which is what they're praying against. Or people may just sit and talk about you. Christians. Criticize one another. Talk about one another. Run one another down. That generates a negative power that's released against the people you talk about. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I could spend an hour on it. Understand? It's very important to know where your problems are coming from. Sometimes they're coming from people quite close to you. There have been men who have been sick for years because their wife had a death wish for them. Understand? There's a lot of things in the human soul that we don't fully understand. It's got a lot of power for good or evil. If it's under the control of the Holy Spirit, it will be for good. But if it's under other forces, it can be just as powerful for evil. And finally, in this section, another source of these problems is what I call unscriptural covenants. In Exodus 23, verse 32, God warned Israel about the nations whose land they were about to enter. They were all wicked, idolatrous nations. And God said to Israel, "You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods." You see, if you make a covenant, which is a very solemn agreement, with evil people who are under the power of evil forces, you come under the power of those evil forces. Now, there are particularly true of secret societies. In America, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan. And worldwide, the Freemasons. Just have to tell you that that is a sure road to disaster for your descendants. I can't estimate the number of crippled, retarded, unhappy children whose problems go back to a parent in the Freemasons. You can do what you like about it, but I'm telling you the consequences are ordered by God, and you can't change them. You are not free to make a covenant with people on the basis of anything but the covenant that's made in the blood of Jesus. That's a very powerful binding covenant, but evil covenants are also powerful and binding. Now, let's look briefly at the forms that blessings and curses take. If you want to study this in detail, there's one chapter that's devoted solely to it. It's chapter 28 of the book of Deuteronomy. It's got 68 verses. The first 14 verses deal with blessings, and the remaining 54 verses deal with curses. And when you've read that list of curses, I think you should want something else. And the source of both blessings and curses is clearly stated, and I'll read them both. Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 and 2. Now it shall come to pass, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you hearken to the voice of the Lord your God. What is the basic cause of blessings? It's listening diligently to the voice of God and doing what he says. That's why God blessed Abraham. He said, because you have obeyed my voice. And then it says, all these blessings will come upon you. Really, you don't need to chase the blessings. What you need to do is meet the conditions. God will take care of the blessings. And then, in verse 15 and onwards, we come to the curses. But it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. What's the cause of the curses? Not listening to the voice of the Lord and not doing what he says. It's very, very simple, basically. Now, if you want to, you can read through that whole list of blessings and curses for yourself. Excuse me. But I will give you my very brief summary. And you check for yourselves. Don't just take it because I say it. Here's my summary of the blessings. Exaltation, being lifted up. Health, reproductiveness, reproducing in every area of your life. Your family, your farm, your animals, everything. Prosperity, victory, and God's favor. I'll read that once more. Exaltation, health, reproductiveness, prosperity, victory, and God's favor. One of the simple statements of blessing is, you'll be above only and not beneath. You'll be the head and not the tail. And I sat down and worked that out once, and I thought, what does it mean to be the head and not the tail? And it's like this. The head makes the decisions, the tail gets dragged around. See? So which end are you, the head or the tail? Are you making the decisions? Are you taking the initiative? Are you determining the way things happen? Or are you at the mercy of circumstances, under financial pressure, health pressure, family pressure, being just dragged around? If you're the tail, it's a curse. If you're the head, it's a blessing. Now let's look at the summary of the curses. And as I said, this is 54 verses, so the summary is brief. First of all, humiliation. Second, failure to reproduce in any area of your life. Barrenness is a curse, without any qualification. Mental and physical sickness, family breakdown, divorce, alienation of children, and so on. Poverty, which is a curse, not a blessing. If you think poverty is a blessing, why do you work so hard to get rid of it? And if you think sickness is a blessing, why do you go to the doctor to get rid of it? Why involve that poor doctor in fighting against God and removing the blessing from your life? Defeat, oppression, failure, and God's disfavor. I'll give it to you once more. Humiliation, failure to reproduce, mental and physical sickness, family breakdown, poverty, defeat, oppression, failure, and God's disfavor. Now, I'll give you my own little list, which is just based on personal experience and observation over the years. I made it independently of that chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. It's interesting how close they are. I have 7 factors in people's lives which, when I discover, lead me to conclude that they're probably under a curse. Number 1, mental and emotional breakdown, and especially emotional breakdown. Now, if it just happens once in one life, there could be other causes. But if it is a thing that recurs frequently in a family, you can be sure that family is under a curse. Number 2, repeated or chronic sicknesses, especially without clear medical diagnosis. When you go to the doctor and he says it's one thing, you go back 6 months later, he says it's another, or you have a pain and nobody can find out why you have a pain, but you have a pain. And especially again, if these things run in families, I would say almost certainly that family is under a curse. Third, repeated miscarriages and related female problems. And Ruth and I have come to the place, if women come for that kind of prayer, which we pray for very frequently, once we hear the diagnosis, we simply treat it as a curse. We don't even do any investigating. And we have seen scores of people dramatically changed. Number 4, the breakdown of marriage and family alienation. And let me just say one thing that I can't take time to explain. Witchcraft is home breaker number 1. Wherever that power comes to work in a family, it will ultimately break up the family. Number 5, continuing financial insufficiency, especially where the income appears sufficient. You know, there are lots of people who always have enough money, but it's never enough. You know that? You might be one of them. Well, you begin to check. I got a letter from a lady in the United States a couple of years ago. She said, I think my husband's family is under a curse. She'd heard my teaching. So I wrote back and said, tell me why you think your husband's family is under a curse. And this was the answer I got. She said, well, my husband's estate runs into hundreds of millions of dollars, and our annual income is $1 million, and we never have enough money. I said, I'm convinced. That's so characteristic, see. If there's a curse over your life, nothing ever really works. And you can be highly educated and qualified to succeed, but you never quite break through to success. Number 6, accident prone. And when I meet that, I really don't look any further. You see, that is a statistically diagnosable condition. If you are accident prone, an insurance company will put up your insurance premium, see, simply on that basis. And number 7, a history of suicides or unnatural deaths. And I hope I can say this without being offensive, but if you want to look at a very conspicuous family that bears all the marks of a family curse, it's the Kennedy family in America. Now, we come to the punchline, the practical, how to pass from curse to blessing. First of all, you have to understand full provision has already been made through the death of Jesus on the cross. That's the way that God has made provision for every human need, including this one. If you look in Galatians chapter 3, verses 13